Okay, John, would you give us your full name?
Sure. It's John Marius Sherin. I was born on August 11th, 1937, in Victory Memorial Hospital. That's on Fort Hamilton Parkway in Brooklyn, 7th Avenue to a lot of folks. It used to be, I don't think it's there anymore, but it used to be located right at the top of Fort Hamilton, which was a very active place during World War II. And right next to or adjacent to a golf course, Dyker Heights Golf Course, which is still there. My mother told me it was a very stormy night coming at the end of an enormous heat wave. And the thunderstorm that occurred that night broke the heat, and I entered the world with a middle name of Marius that appeared on both sides of the family, strangely enough. Marius, I always loved my middle name, even as an elementary school kid. You would think that anybody with a name like, it reminds me of the Johnny Cash song about, a guy named Sue. Marius does come from Marion, comes from Mary. However, when I looked it up, even as a kid, I went to books and I researched the name, and I found that Marius was Marius the Epicurean, who was a Roman emperor. But Marius was also the centurion who pierced the side of Christ to make sure that he was dead when he was hanging on the cross. What that told me was that there was power in this name. There was substance in the name, and I was always proud of it, primarily because it was my maternal grandfather's name. His name was Marius Anderson with an E. He was Danish. He was born in Jutland. His first name was Christian Marius, but my grandmother always, when she was angry at him, always called him Marius. And I grew up with my grandfolks and for a good many of my earlier years, and I have a deep love even now for both of them. So that was Marius on my mother's side. My father had Marius on his side of the family as well. And he's an immigrant from Ireland, came here in the at the end of the 20s, right as the Depression was about to hit us full force. He arrived. And so I have great uncles on the other side of the family who were Marius as well. At any rate, I love the name, and I always used it when I was younger. Many people would just give their first and last name. I always used to give my middle name because I was so proud of it. We lived in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge, for most of my early years. We lived first on 79th Street. That's where my folks moved from my grandmother and grandfather's house when I was very young. I should probably start there. We lived with my grandparents, who were living on 77th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues in those years.
I just want to interrupt you.
Sure.
You mentioned them as your grandparents, but you haven't said their names.
Okay. My mother's name was Gina, Georgine, and my grandfather's name was, as I said, Christian Marius. Both of them were immigrants from Denmark, so my mother was a first-generation American. We lived with them for probably no more than a year until my parents moved up to 79th Street on the other side of 7th Avenue and became lifelong friends with their landlady and the landlady's family. That was, we knew her only as kids. We knew her as Tante, but her name was Nelson. They were Norwegian, because at that time that part of Brooklyn was a very Scandinavian area. Danes and Norwegians were there, and Swedes in great numbers. Right down at the end of the block on 7th Avenue and 79th Street, there was a public school, and that's where I went to kindergarten. That was PS 127. It's still standing, although much of the neighborhood has been divided because of the approach to the Verrazano Bridge. When that was put in, it cut a swath through Brooklyn. Ironically, my grandmother's house, which was 1177 77th Street, is the last house on the block that was not purchased when they made the right-of-way. So that still is there, even though it's no longer in the family.
When did they come from Jutland?
They arrived here, independent of one another, around 1904, 1905. My grandmother came and got a job as a domestic, working in the homes of very wealthy people in their summer home in Seacliff. They were a family that owned a big department store in Chicago at the time. I don't recall the name, even though I have it in my record somewhere, the name of the department store. But she worked for them, and at that point, Seacliff there were a lot of religious communities that were in Seaford. The big paddle boats came in, and they took people back and forth to the city to shop. My grandmother, as I said, was a governess or a domestic there. Ironically, my grandfather, who came in as an 18-year-old kid with about, I guess you were required to have the equivalent of 5 pounds in your pocket when you arrived. He came across having purchased a ticket steerage, but when he got on board, met someone he knew from Denmark who said, I don't want to see you go steerage. You come on upstairs and stay with me. So he stayed in the first class cabin for the remainder of the trip. And when he came here, established himself as a cabinet maker. He had been apprenticed back home in Denmark, and when he came here, he took his skills, eventually established a business in Brooklyn, making spiral staircases, those old staircases, like when Loretta Young used to enter a room, she'd come down this big staircase and her dress would swirl out into the room. And they made all of those in a shop in Brooklyn, and my grandfather would be hired by very wealthy people to go and actually supervise the cutting of the tree that they wanted to use to make the stairs. And they would be all hand-turned and made on big machines, and I spent a good many happy hours as a child playing in the shop and learning very early the difference in appearance and the aroma between mahogany and yellow pine and white pine and birch.
Where the business was?
The business was in Sunnyside Park, I think, if that is, yeah, Sunnyside, I think that's where it was. Sunnyside, was it Sunnyside Park? I believe that's where it was, in a section of Brooklyn.
And the name of it?
Well, it was Marius Anderson Stair Builder. That was his company. Of course, it disappeared during the Depression. He lost everything. My grandfather was a very, very spiritual man, a very good man, but he was less of a businessman based on the decisions that he made. William Levitt came to him at one point and asked him to put stairs in all of his houses. And when my grandfather saw the plan and saw what the stairs looked like, he said, I would never do that kind of work. And it reminds me of Frank Lloyd Wright, who looked with disdain on the Levitt house, that he would never do it, something like that. It was beneath him. Well, obviously somebody else jumped right in, took that job, and then proceeded to do a lot of contract work for the government during World War II and became multi-millionaires, while my grandfather lost his business and so on as a result of the Depression. My grandmother and grandfather had 8 children, and my grandmother was always afraid of somebody kidnapping the children. This is during the era of the Weinberg baby kidnapping, and because he was billed in the Brooklyn Eagle as the millionaire Dane of Brooklyn, even though he wasn't, he was very active with the Danish church, helped bring a lot of immigrants over, establish them in this country, get them jobs. He did work to the point where he was knighted by the King of Denmark, and he had the sash and the cross and the documents until he died. And when he died, let's see, it was in the early 60s, I believe, if memory serves. I remember an emissary coming from the Danish crown to pick up his credentials and pick up his cross and pick up all his official documents, because it was something that lasted only as long as the life lasted, and then it went back to the crown. But he was Sir Marius Anderson. Not that he used the title, but it was an honor that he took very seriously. Anyway, we moved from their place to 79th Street. I went to elementary school in PS 127. I can still, there are times, we've talked about aromas when I've done these interviews. I could almost recognize the aroma of the basement of 127 where we registered to go to school, as I can remember, and I think we've talked about this, the aroma of a children's section of a library, the books. And they're all wonderful memories. They're wonderful associations.
You have brothers or sisters?
I have a sister who was 4 years younger than I was, and one day when we lived at the top floor of, I'm going to tell you about her. One day, Betty Ann heard the fire engines, because there was a fire engine up the street from us on 79th Street that would always come down. It was a hook and ladder company. As they came down the street on the way to responding to an alarm, we would both rush to the front windows, which were bow windows of this, what would you call it? Not a track house, but they were connected. They were connected. And she tripped, and she always used to walk with her tongue between her teeth. And so I will always remember that she fell, and she almost took her tongue off, and there was blood everywhere. And I can remember the screams and the howls and the blood, and my poor mother panicking, and they called a surgeon, and the doctor came over. And in those days, they had everybody hold her down on the kitchen table, and they stitched her right there without anything. That was it. She just stitched her back up. We've come a long way, baby, from those days. My brother wasn't born yet. He wasn't born for 4 more years. And my brother Michael is a very successful entrepreneur. He's an accountant by profession. Mike is now chairman of the board of the Garden City Group, which is a financial services company that has recently relocated to one of the quads in Melville. And the company has been purchased by Crawford. I think they're out of Atlanta, Georgia, but Mike is still working for them. And loves his work, as well he should. My sister is married. She has 6 children. They live my sister and Ron Trapani, her husband, live in Denver. And their children now are spread across the United States, because they've moved first to Ohio and then to Minnesota, and gradually ended up in Denver. And the kids were left as they formed relationships and moved along. So we have a very large family, and if I start mentioning all the names, that will be the tape. So I'm going to defer from doing that at the moment, and just tell you that
with all this family living so close together, the holidays must have been rather important.
The greatest holiday of all was Christmas. Birthdays and things like that we celebrated. There was a time when we lived almost close enough to one another in Bay Ridge that we could, in a stroller, walk to visit my Aunt Jean, who lived down in the Bays, down on Bay 13th Street. That was a trolley ride away in those days. Or later on, you could take a bus to get to Cropsey Avenue and then walk down. But the stroller would take us to 86th Street, where my Aunt Isabel lived with her family, on right across from the Diker golf course. My Aunt Millie and her husband Knu lived with my grandparents for a bit of time, so we would see them too. We could visit. We were a very close family. We used to visit with my Aunt Elsa and her husband, my Uncle Harold, who was one of the Anderson children, one of the 8. He was in the Coast Guard, was an engineer, but during World War II was assigned to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and they lived near Owl's Head Park, I recall. And so we could visit them too. And some of our early birthdays, you mentioned the holidays, were great parties where all the grandchildren, there were 24 of them, we would all get together and we had great times. Christmas was the best, though, because that was at Nana and Grandpa's house on 77th Street. And you can imagine a brownstone with a huge tree in the living room by the windows, piled almost 6 foot high with gifts for everybody. And my grandfather would be not dress up as Santa Claus. He would just, after we had eaten and after they had always, he would always read the story from the scripture of Christmas. And then the kids would be impatient as the carols were sung because you couldn't wait for the last carols. And is that okay now, Grandma? Is that enough, Nana? Can we go? And then finally the okay would be given and the paper would fly and the ribbons would fly and you would be walking around.
Now, was that Christmas Eve?
That was Christmas Eve. That was Christmas Eve. And if it snowed on the way in, because at that point we were living out of Brooklyn, we had moved. If it snowed on the way in, that was a bonus. Just the idea that it would be, over the river and through the woods, that we would be going into Brooklyn to celebrate with all our cousins. We eventually moved from Brooklyn. My parents bought a house in Floral Park. God knows what they must have paid for it. I can't imagine they paid more than $6,000 or $7,000 for it. It was a small house, but to us it was incredible to be out in what we thought was the country, where there were lightning bugs and butterflies. And my mother could have her garden, and I learned all the names of all the flowers from her, watching her plant everything from hollyhocks to lilies of the valley to portulaca. It was all, it was, that was her one of her enjoyments.
That's where you graduated from high school?
No. My father and mother kept the house for a few years. We lived there till around the end of the 40s. And at that point, they decided they wanted to move and buy a house further out, where Hicksville was exploding at that time. Plainview, Hicksville, in that area. But they couldn't afford the money for a down payment. My father was a New York City fireman. He was still working and trying to scrape together enough money for a down payment on a house. It was decided that we would all move back to Brooklyn and live with my aunt and uncle in their home on 86th Street for a year. And in that time, since they wouldn't be paying rent, they would save enough money for a down payment on a house, and then they'd be able to move out to the island the way they wanted to. The law had recently changed. Actually, the law was still in place that required firemen to live within the city limits, but during the era of the threat of nuclear holocaust, they realized that if all the firemen lived in the city and a bomb was ever dropped, that would take care of the entire fire department. Much as recently we've discovered what happened when a couple of buildings came down in New York. So they eased the requirement, allowing firemen to live outside the city, and some firemen moved to Belrose, Floral Park, right outside the city limits, and made a 40-minute commute back to work. But in order, as I say, to get the money, my folks decided to move in with my Aunt Isabel. Well, let me tell you, folks, we all know what the immigrant experience is with all these people crowded in one room. Well, my mother and all of us kids, the three of us, Mike, Betty, and myself, were first-generation Americans. My father was born over there, so he could be considered an immigrant even at that point. We lived in one large studio. It was a downstairs, you might even say a basement. You entered from the street level and you went up. But for their house, which was a brick row house with a very high flight of stairs that went up to their porch. That was like living in a dungeon for a year. Very difficult. I look back now and I say, my parents did the best they could with what they had, but it was tough on the kids, on all of us. My brother and sister went to PS 201. It was a middle school, a junior high in those days, and I went to New Utrecht High School. I left out 1 year of high school at Sewanaka because I was still living in Floral Park, and I left my elementary school having graduated. And I want to come back to that, Karen. I forgot about that part. I got into the future too quickly. When we lived in Floral Park on Deepan Avenue, we were down the street from St. Hedwig's, which is a Polish school established by Polish immigrants. There was a grade school attached to it, and it was part of the Diocese of Brooklyn in those days. Rockville Center as a diocese didn't exist yet. We were taught Polish. There was no choice. You went to a Polish school, you learned Polish. And of course, as a third, fourth, fifth, sixth grader, I was there through the 8th grade. There came a point where I really didn't want to learn Polish. What am I going to need Polish for? So when the option was given to opt out with your parental approval, my parents didn't have any difficulty saying, okay, you don't have to take Polish. So I stopped. Now I wish I had continued to take Polish, but I still remember some of what I learned in those classes, specifically prayers that I was taught and that we said every day. When I left the 8th grade, I was awarded a medal for excellence in American history, a gold medal from the American Legion. When later on, many years later, I started Hofstra, and I was asked, what do you want to major in? Believe it or not, I didn't know what to major in, so I thought, well, I must be good at history, so I'll major in history, because I was given a medal once. So these little things do have an enormous impact, even though at the time you don't think that they might. I went for not a full year, but a partial year to Sewanaka, which was walking distance from where we lived in Floral Park, across the railroad tracks and to the school. It was a great school, and I hated to leave it, but we were going back to Brooklyn. And when we got back to Brooklyn, I entered a whole different world. I was registered. I had wanted to go to Fort Hamilton High School, which was a beautiful big school right overlooking the harbor in New York, but we were not in that district, and I was told that I had to register at New Utrecht High School. New Utrecht was a huge stone edifice. The cafeteria was on the 5th floor. There were upstairs and downstairs. It was another world for me. There were large numbers of people, all ethnic, mostly Jewish and Italian, though, at that time in that neighborhood. And I went there for 2 years and had some wonderful memories of the teachers that I met. Sammy Applebaum, who was my French teacher. I remember an English teacher I had that I was in love with. She was young, she was blonde. I had a crush on her, and when she got married, I went to her wedding to punish myself further, to see her walking down the aisle with somebody else. And she was married in Victory Memorial. I'm sorry, she was married in Our Lady of Victory. I'm thinking of the hospital. She was married in Lady of Victory in Floral Park. And so I came back to Floral Park. My father drove me so that I could go in and watch her be married. I attended New Utrecht for 2 years. And then we moved back to Hicksville, where my folks bought a place on Oak Street and probably paid, I would think about $16,000 for the house. And began my 11th year. So I did my 11th year in what was the Hicksville High School at the time. I didn't know at that point that they were building a new high school, and I only had 1 year to spend there. And at the end of that year, that became the junior high, and the Division Avenue School, which is still Hicksville High School today to all its graduates since 1956, is where I graduated. So I went to 4 high schools, and it was because there was a lot of moving. My brother and sister also had the same experience. My folks lived in Hicksville until my father died in 1978. He died of colon cancer that unfortunately had not been picked up on time, and it had spread to his major organs, and it finally took him in March of 1978. He was buried on St. Patrick's Day. My mother lived in the house for a while longer, making periodic visits to my sister, who was traveling and moving in different parts of the country. And ultimately, she decided to move and sell her house in Hicksville, and felt so guilty because she sold the house for the astronomical sum of $78,000, and felt so guilty that this young couple coming in were going to have to pay such an enormous amount of money. And And today that property is probably valued at $250,000, I would imagine, you know, in that part of Hicksville. But at any rate, she died 2 years ago of Alzheimer's disease at the age of 86, I believe, 86 or 87 she was when she passed away. But as people will tell you, Alzheimer's is the long goodbye, and we watched her leave us little by little by little for a period of about 7 or 8 years, and it was very tough. Because even though somewhere deep inside there was the person that we knew and loved was still there, it wasn't her anymore. And it was almost a blessing. It was a release in both the case of my mother and father to see them finally succumb to.
Before we leave your parents, just go back. Where was your father stationed at the time?
My father was in Engine 282 in Brooklyn. He came in to the department, took the test in 1936, a year before I was born, took all the tests to increase his rank every time one was offered. But because he wasn't a war veteran, and the reason he wasn't a veteran is because he got a deferment because of his service. And he passed all the tests. He had good grades, but he was always passed over by veterans who were coming back and others. And it was just not intended to be. Nevertheless, when he retired after 20 years in the New York City Fire Department, he was, at that point, he had been acting lieutenant for so many years because he had all the qualifications, even though he didn't have the rank. He was driving for Chief Huey McMichael, and so he was his chauffeur, his driver. And they were very good friends, both on the job and off the job, and we were very friendly with his family. And we've lost touch with one another since my father has passed away. But we have some wonderful memories of those years, and my going in with him to communion breakfasts and feeling the camaraderie and feeling the loyalty and the love of the job that those men had, and the enormous courage. I would look at my father as a child and imagine, you know, I could never be like him. First of all, he had a 4-inch chest expansion when he took a deep breath. And I remember his thin waist and his enormous chest and the strength of the man. And then his intellectual abilities. I just was blown away by the fact that he spoke several languages. He had studied classical Greek and knew Latin. There wasn't a word that he didn't know the derivation of because of his knowledge of the language. And he, of course, knew and could read Gaelic, the Irish language, and he could speak French. I mean, he knew French. He didn't speak French. He knew a little French. I just thought, I'll never know as much as he knows. I'll never be as smart. And then as you grow up and you go to college and you come back and you realize your parents are very smart in certain ways, but they're different ways from the way you are smart. And gradually I began to come to understand that I was okay. I didn't have to be like him. I could have my own ideas and think my own politics, which I did, and we had some incredible arguments that my mother would go into her kitchen, into what she called her corner, and she would start singing hymns, and that would be our signal to cool it. I tell you, Mom's starting to get worried, you know, getting a little bit too intense.
Where did you go to college?
I decided after a year of working for the County of Nassau, the county clerk's office. I left high school. I took a job with the county clerk because we knew the committeemen in the area, and those things happened only when you were politically connected. And I, matter of fact, registered for the Republican Party because you would never get a job in government if you weren't a Republican in those years. I went to work for, as I say, the county clerk. I was appointed to work in the document room because I thought I wanted to be an attorney, and I wanted to get some experience working with attorneys. So from 1957, I worked with attorneys, bringing them papers and filing documents and watching how they conducted themselves and listening to clients and listening to people who worked around attorneys. And after that limited experience, I remember deciding, I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't like this. This is awful. But no one was there to tell me, John, there's different kinds of law. If you don't like this kind of law and litigation, you can become a corporate lawyer, or you could become a family, a divorce lawyer or a bankruptcy lawyer. I didn't know about any of that, and as a result, I just said, no, I think I'm going to college. I'm going to get a degree, and I'll decide what I want to do as I get my degree. I remember the day I walked into Ed Frankie's office, who was the county clerk at the time. He was a big man, imposing figure, and I can remember him sitting in his corner office with the snow coming down out the windows in February of 1957, and I can remember thinking to myself, this is a day that is going to change my life. It's going to be very different for me from now on. I didn't know where I was going with my life. I just knew that I no longer was going to be an attorney. And for me, that meant I was no longer going to get into politics, and I was no longer going to try for the Senate or to be President of the United States, which I had early fantasies of being. I registered and began my studies at Hofstra University in the spring of 1957, and I graduated with a BA and majored in history in 1961. I continued there part-time and completed my master's degree at Hofstra University. It was then a university. When I began, it was a college, but in the meantime, it had become a university. I graduated in, I believe it was 77 or 78, finally, with a master's degree in philosophy, in foundations of education, and cultural anthropology, I believe, is some of the things that I studied.
Your first paying job in Nassau County Jail?
My first paying job was walking distance from our home on Deep End Avenue in Floral Park. I got a job working for an elderly Italian man who had a produce shop, fresh produce. I bagged potatoes into 5-pound bags, and he would give me 50 cents at the end of the afternoon, and also give me a peck of assorted fruit that were probably on the verge of starting to turn, but that didn't matter to me because I was helping out at home. These were times when there wasn't enough money to buy coal, and I wanted to go up to the local cabinet shops up on Jericho Turnpike and with a wagon and load it with wood that I would bring home, and we would burn wood or anything else that I'd go down to the railroad siding off Floral Park and take green lumber that was used as, I guess it was packing or dunnage in some of the freight trains, and left on the siding, and I would grab it home. And the nails were so hard to get out because it was still green. But that lumber eventually, my father, when I think of he eventually used that lumber that I brought home to build a little back porch on the house. Something that if I were him, I would never have done, because working with it was too hard. It was like cutting through a piece of steel. It was not seasoned lumber. It was not aged lumber. But I guess he wanted me to see that I was helping, and he appreciated it. Let's see, where was I? I was talking about a graduate. Oh no, you asked me about a part-time job.
Yeah,
I mean, my first paying job. That was my first paying job, 50 cents for an afternoon's work. My next job was for Homecraft on Tulip Avenue in Floral Park, or Tyson or Tulip. They were a home appliance. They sold stoves, refrigerators, and they also installed Van Packer chimneys. It was a kit, I guess, that went either on top of or instead of a brick chimney. But my job was to dust the appliances, to sweep out the rubber runner that went through the showroom, and then I went out and I had to clean up the yard of all of the old cardboard and stuff. But part of my job was to clean the men's room and the ladies' room. And so I remember I must have been 12 years old, 13 years old, I was cleaning toilets. And I thought to myself, it's got to get better than this. Anything is better than this. And it did get better than that, because before I left Hicksville, before I moved away from Hicksville, I had turned an early love of music into a way of making money. I knew from my father's family that there was musical talent in the family. My Uncle Con, my father's brother, was a musical director of sacred music for the Diocese of Ossory in the south of Ireland. He had perfect pitch, and also rebuilt and repaired these old organs, these magnificent organs that have been around for hundreds of years. But his love of music, while he was alive, he would write operas. In addition to his sacred duties, he would write operas. And I knew that I had musical abilities through the family. We had a cousin of my father who had once been an organist at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan. I had an early love. The first instrument was the ukulele, and then it was the harmonica, and then it was a guitar. And my father refused to pay for lessons because he says I bounced from one thing to the next. He wasn't sure that I was going to stick with anything. So my part-time job, I earned enough money to get about 4 or 5 lessons on the guitar, which taught me the basic chords that I could probably sing and play 40 different songs. And that was okay until in Hicksville, I met some friends that also played guitar, and they wanted to put a band together. And I said, well, we can't have all guitars. Somebody's got to play another instrument. I said, I'll learn to play the bass. So I looked in the paper, and I saw an ad for a 3/4-inch upright concert K bass for sale. And I went in, drove. At that point I was driving. I drove into Queens, and this was a fellow who had worked his way through dental school playing the bass, and now was selling the instrument. I bought it for $350. I still have the bass. I still play the bass, and that became the beginnings of a band composed of 5 fellas that we worked with all the way through college. We continued to do weddings and all those kinds of engagements afterward, and are still playing to this day, with the exception of the fact that we lost Joe Caruso, our piano player, just a couple of years ago to prostate cancer. But we play matter of fact, they surprised me a couple of weeks ago. Came out, my daughter gave me a surprise birthday party. I was 65 in August of this year, and I thought that I can talk them all out of not going there with a party. And here we are in October, and it was in late September that I walked into her backyard one Sunday afternoon, and here's family from all over the country and the rest of the fellas from the band, and they're playing. And in 15 minutes, I was playing with them. And we do that. We get together once every year on New Year's Day, and we usher in the new year by playing. Many of our old things were based on George Shearing sound and vocals like the Four Freshmen and the High-Lows. And believe it or not, you do that when you're 26 years old, and you don't do it for 40 years, and you get back together, and it's like riding a bike. It's right there.
How did you decide to become a teacher?
About my 3rd year of Hofstra, I had a teacher, Charles Calitri. He was an inspiration. He was a writer. He had a published writer, and he had taught at NYU. But when he was teaching at Hofstra, he taught a class in creative writing, which I took. And as a result of watching and listening and learning from him, he blew me away. I had not taken any education classes until that time. I said, I want to be like this guy. I want to do what he does. And probably more than any single factor, short of the fact that my father always said to me, you should be a teacher. Early on, he thought I should be a salesman because I could sell magazines door to door. I was good with people. I had people skills, and he thought I should go into sales. And then he thought I should be a teacher. And I told him, based on the treatment that I saw my teachers get in high school in Brooklyn and even on the island here, I said, there's no way I want to subject myself to that kind of abuse. I would never want to be a teacher until I met Charlie Calitri. And I got his take on things. His very compassionate, humanistic. In those days, of course, everybody was, what is it, the Jean-Paul Sartre school of, what's the philosophy? I can't even think of it. No, that's something else too. I'm thinking of, it'll come to me. I can't think of the word. But I admired him, and I was moved to take some ed courses. And in so doing, I majored in the foundations of education, which at that point, she became my cooperating teacher, was Marianne Raywood, Dr. Raywood, later, at that point, married someone who I came to know very well, Dr. Raymond Sheely, who was also teaching at Hofstra University at that point. But my decision to become a teacher was made rather dramatically at one point. I had a friend who taught in Plainview High School. We lived in the same area, Hicksville. I met him when I was experimenting, doing some student teaching. Marianne Raywood was my cooperating teacher. I met him at Plainview High School, Plainview Old Bethpage, where I student taught. And somehow, I wasn't quite sure whether this is what I want to do. But he was taking classes all the time into Broadway shows, and I decided to help out one time. We went to see A Man for All Seasons with a group. Schofield was in the lead role, Paul Schofield. And it was while sitting in that theater and listening to the dialogue between Sir Thomas More and one of his friends who was deciding whether or not he should become a teacher or not, that I decided to become a teacher, because the dialogue went something like this. He says, I don't know what I want to do. He says, why don't you be a teacher? And that's what my father had always been saying to me. He said, nah, I don't want to be a teacher. Nobody will ever know me. Nobody will ever know who I am. He says, oh, is that right? So Sir Thomas More said to him, well, let's examine that for a moment. He said, let's see. He said, your wife will know. Your children will know. All your friends will know. And God will know. He says, that's pretty good following. And I thought to myself, I like the logic there. I don't need notoriety. My ego doesn't need all that. And besides which, I think I can get some of the skills based on some of the mentoring that I was having then that will make me a better teacher than many of the teachers that I've had. And that happened around 1960. Then I heard that Brentwood was a good place to work. I heard about it because Dr. Sheely was part of a Ford Foundation grant in Brentwood, and there's going to be a great future for any young people going to Brentwood today. And this was probably, I'm leaving out other chapters. I looked around for I was offered a job in Plainview when I left the student teaching. The chairman of the department there, Donald Begall, offered me a job immediately, and I thanked him, but I didn't want to work in that district. I felt that I hadn't yet realized it, but I realized that there was more of a match for me in a district like Brentwood which at the time was working class. I really identified with some of the classes I had. And at that point, we had tracking. There were D track classes and C, which was an average kid, and then you had A, B, and honors track. And I loved working with the classes that were designated D track, the C and the D. These were what Gabe, what's his name, that did Welcome Home Kotter used to call sweat hogs. These were the kids these were real people. These became the civil servants later on. These became the guys who were always there for you. and they had a kind of intelligence that I guess I didn't have. I wasn't a survivor on the streets, and these kids had something that I admired, whereas the very bright students and the honor students, I was a little intimidated. I always felt that they were smarter than I was. And I didn't realize that my experience and my age gave me an edge that they didn't have. That didn't come until later. But I liked working with, I like working with the.
Who interviewed you for your job in Brentwood?
When I decided that Brentwood was where I wanted to be, and not West Babylon and not Plainview, I came out and was interviewed by Fred Weaver and Milt Seiler. Milt Seiler, I remember some of the discussion that took place with him. It had to do with Jerome Bruner. He was one of the writers that was very in at the time, and wrote a little book in which he proposed that you could teach any subject to any child at any time. It's all a way in which you presented it, but any subject could be taught at any time to any child at any age. And that was all the rage in Brentwood at that time, along with Piaget, as you said, and the philosophy was very important. Well, the interview went well. I can't remember specific questions that Fred asked me, but I know that at the moment I can't think of anything that happened in the interview that's memorable. But I did get the job, and I started working in the fall of 1963. This, of course, let me think. Yeah, fall of 62. I'm sorry. It was the fall of 62 that I started working. Now, I know that coincided with the assassination of John Kennedy that happened just a couple of months later, which for any of the people who might see this, any of us who are of this generation will remember, that was traumatic because there was a mood change that was the likes of which that none of us had ever experienced before. From a time of enormous optimism and hope in the future, it was as if somebody had pulled the rug right out from under you, and in the real world, it was not going to be at all what you thought it was going to be. And for a while, that profoundly affected the way you thought and taught. There was a kind of an optimism that you lost for a little while. At any rate, now also in November of my first year teaching, I got married, and my wife's name was Pat Higgins. I thought that coming from an Irish background with a name like Higgins, we were going to have an enormous bit in common. She was also the same religion that I was, and I thought, this is it for life.
Where did you meet her?
I met her, I was playing a music engagement. I was playing a Sweet 16 party, and she was a guest at the party. We were both in our 20s. I was probably 26 years old. I knew her for 6 months, and we married on November 30th. From out of that marriage, 2 children were born. Heather Laura, and John Marius Sherin Jr. They are the love and the joys of my life. I was married to their mother until 1979, at which point we were divorced, and I was a free man for about 3 or 4 years, and then I met Ellen. And I hadn't realized that I had known Ellen. I had met Ellen before, but was never focused on the fact that I had met her or knew her. I used to do Christmas parties for her company in New York City. And so I've been playing all through the 70s for Chemical Corporation when they'd have their wonderful Christmas parties, and she was always part of the performance. And that is, the company would do a show, they would write songs, and I had met her then, but I wasn't I wasn't looking to get married. I wasn't interested in meeting anybody, and it wasn't until I was divorced that we met again at the Milleridge Cottage right here in Jericho at a wedding of a friend of hers. And it's ironic that she suggested, when her friend was looking for a band, why don't you hire the fellas that we always have for our Christmas party? So this girlfriend had hired me, and I played the wedding. And while at the wedding, I noticed Ellen. And from that point on, we began.
So you're picking up girls at gigs.
I picked up this one. Actually, no. I offered to drive. Yes. I offered to drive her home that night, and she absolutely turned me down flat. She insisted on going home with the person who had brought her, and I admired her for that because I thought that was the appropriate thing to do. I want to go back and talk a little bit more about John and Heather. Heather came into Pat's and my life within almost 9 months, I think, to the day of our honeymoon. I was working, playing music again at the Snapper Inn out in Oakdale on the night that she was born. I didn't know my wife was going to end up in the hospital giving birth that night, or I certainly could have called and gotten a replacement. I knew she was getting close, but I didn't see that it was that close. I got a phone call, or I called at some point during the night. I got a phone call from my mother-in-law at the time telling me that I was now the proud father of a baby girl and they were in Huntington Hospital and everybody was doing well, and I ran right over there as soon as I finished that evening. I have a fond connection with the Snapper Inn for that reason. Johnny came into our lives in 1968. It was a rough year historically for all of us, but he was a blessed event that has given incredible joy to all of us, his mother and Ellen and myself. Heather is working for International Lighting at the moment. She has an associate's degree from Suffolk and then went to work for International Lights. She does estimates for them, is an integral part of their corporate family, has an enormous amount of responsibility, and I'm very proud of the way she conducts herself and her life. She commutes, and in that, I don't envy her that commute every single day back and forth into Manhattan. She is presently single, and she's living in Bethpage, very close, so we see one another frequently. John is a flight attendant with Continental Airlines, lives in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, and Johnny is a Spanish speaker. Ironically, he did not. He decided when he got out of high school and he started college, and he went to Stony Brook for a while. He went to Nassau Community. It was at that point that he also decided, and again, the kids had a rough time financially coming out of a marriage that had not lasted for them. Both of them went to work before completing their degrees. And at some point, John decided that he had this love of flying and always wanted to do that. From the time he was a little boy, he had a fascination with airplanes. We went to his graduation down in Houston, Ellen and I, and then he decided he would like to fly to Spanish-speaking countries, so he, on his own, and because of a lot of the friends that he had, self-taught Spanish, took the test that the company gave, and he was tested by a German speaker who didn't speak a word of English, and the only way they could communicate was in Spanish. So he took the test and passed the test, and then so he's been flying back and forth to South America, to Mexico City and Spanish-speaking countries since he did that. Now the airlines are having a rough time, and Continental is no exception. There are a lot of changes going on. John right now is flying back and forth to Puerto Rico, which is not so tough to take because he spends a good part of his week there and then comes home for the weekends. We don't see as much of one another as we'd like, but that stands to reason because he's away all week long and tired by the time he gets home.
Do you have any children from your second marriage?
Ellen and I don't have any children. I guess if we were going to do that, that decision would have been made early on. I think with all the baggage that I brought into our relationship, it was probably a decision that I know part of Ellen regrets, as does her mother and dad, that we didn't bring any beautiful children into the world from our union. But I am very grateful for the relationship that Ellen now has with both John and Heather. She's been a surrogate mom to John for as long or even longer than his own mother, and therefore there is a closeness that they have developed because he lived with us for so long, came to live with us. While I met Ellen, she was living in Manhattan. She was living on 15th Street, right across from Stuyvesant Park. She had a beautiful apartment in a doorman building. And unfortunately, it was too small for all of us to live there. And therefore, when John came to live with us, we began immediately having to look for a place to live that would accommodate all of us. And that's what brought us out to Long Island. That's what brought us to the Jericho School District. And that's why we're still it's not why we're still where we are. It just got very comfortable. And when John moved on, Ellen and I decided to stay because we liked what we had created here.
Packing is terrible.
Oh, I know.
Our paths have crossed a couple of times in the course of our careers in Brentwood, and I sat on the sabbatical committee that gave you a sabbatical. Could you tell me about the sabbatical?
I sure can. I forgot that, Karen. I applied for a sabbatical after I'd been working in the district for 7 years, and because we still had sabbaticals. And a sabbatical, for those of you who may not know what it is, was an opportunity to take a leave of absence with pay for 6 months, full pay, or a full year at half pay. And I applied for 6 months at full pay. And what I proposed to do at that time was to do an inventory of the industry. Now, this is before the internet and before computers would have given you this information at your fingertips. To make a directory of all of the industry that was at that time in Brentwood for the purpose of putting together a resource that people who wanted to buy wholesale or wanted to buy at substantial discount could go to the plants, the factories that were in their neighborhood that they didn't even know what was being made there, and buy things from their outlet. It was also an opportunity, I saw it as an opportunity, to get connections to help my students get part-time jobs, because that was a big thing at that point. Let's see, we're talking about the early 70s. The economy was doing very poorly. Part-time jobs were not readily available to our students, and so I saw that as a way. Ralph Agiro later on used that same directory that was created, I understand, to raise money for the scholarship funds, because he had already access now of the owners of the various companies that were in Brentwood at the time and the number of employees and so on. The reason the sabbatical, Karen, changed my perspective on teaching enormously. And I say that because I did not have to be in and check in and sign in at 7 o'clock in the morning and take a homeroom. Sabbaticals were the greatest thing in the world for teachers. It was for me. I got up when I wanted to get up, when I'd had a full 8 hours sleep, which I need. I would get dressed and come into Brentwood because I couldn't stay away. I just loved being there. And after I did what I wanted to do in the morning, like going out and canvassing and getting this information, I would stop in at the school, and I might even make a plan to go out and have lunch with somebody that I'd met from the Chamber of Commerce or the Lions Club or Kiwanis in Brentwood. I got to know people in the community. I got to know the movers and the shakers and the banks and some of the companies. And I realized for the first time what it felt like to be a professional. Because when you were working and your nose is to the grindstone in the classroom and there is no time and there's not enough money and you're exhausted at the end of the day, you don't get to breathe the air that what you would consider a professional is normally accustomed to breathing and making decisions for which you are solely responsible. The taste of that freedom said, there's got to be another way to do this profession. There has to be a better way, both to teach children and to help kids and help teachers as well. There's got to be something better than this. I got involved after that with a group of people. Andy Kokari was in the employ of the district at that time. He had to, of course, was in the physical ed area, but he was also a health educator. He, with a group of people he knew, had applied for and received funding under the Duryea bill to develop a program to prevent people and kids from getting into abusing drugs. They had received a grant that enabled them to train teams of 6 people, I believe it was, 6 people from 40 communities in Nassau County and 40 communities in Suffolk County at a residential program at C.W. Post for a week apiece. And this was going to happen in the summer of 1970. He came to me and interviewed me and asked me if I would become a director of group dynamics for a company that was sponsoring this called EDC, Educational Dynamics Corporation. They were located in Patchogue. And I readily agreed, and with a couple of other teachers that were in Brentwood at the time, one whose name, Clay White, was the fellow that was in Brentwood at the time. I don't remember what department he taught in. But he came from a background where he had had a lot of humanistic training as a facilitator. And I learned a great deal from him, watching him, listening to him. And then I was writing some curriculum at the time for BOCES that was funded by BOCES. I was writing curriculum with some other people for African American history and for ethnic studies. And as a result of that, we were paid not in cash, but in money to buy books. And I used the purchase of those books to educate myself about experiential education and training in as a facilitator. Milt Seiler, meanwhile, had taken a leave of absence and had gotten a degree at some similar agency in New York City called Growth. I think it was called Growth Incorporated or some, but he received some kind of certification in that kind of humanistic education while I was going through this other thing. We developed the program for Andy Kokari's workshop at Post, and I found as a result of that, I was on such a high. I learned so much. I was working with Michael Koss from Stony Brook University, who was a director of health and sciences out there. I visited drug rehab centers in Manhattan, on 14th Street, way over on the west side. I think it was not Odyssey House, Daytop Village. And they started in Staten Island, but the home that I visited and the commentary that I heard from these people and an off-Broadway show that they put together inspired me to do something like that in a public school setting for kids who were not involved in drugs, but the emotional intelligence that they could get from it would not take a year. It might take a weekend. It might take an experience. Sometimes it was one of those epiphanies that happens in just a few minutes. And you see that every once in a while as a teacher in a classroom when somebody goes, "Oh, wow!" And the light goes on, but you don't get enough of them. And I wanted to get more, and I saw this a way of making it happen. Ken Moss came to me back probably in the early 70s and said, "John, why don't we create an alternative school?" And I thought of Kenny as weird. At the time, I just thought Ken was too different for me. He was in the English department. We were not socially friendly. I only know him through school. And I was much more conservative than he was at that point. And I just thought, "No, Ken, thanks. I didn't want to work with Ken Moss. I didn't want to work with Kim. And actually, Milt Seiler's intelligence was of such a caliber that, and his way of running a department was so humanistic, even before any of the training, that I admired him as a manager, as a leader, as an administrator. And I admired his ability with kids, much as I came to admire Ken's talents and skills with kids later on. But when the district announced that they were thinking of, they were going to encourage somebody to write an alternative school program. At that point, I remembered what Ken had said, and at that point I went back and I talked to him again, and I said, yeah, maybe we can do something together. And that, of course, following on the, talking about the sabbatic leave and where that led me to the steps to discover other things, and eventually, I guess I was prepared. 1973 was the year that happened, and 1973 was a year that I was doing some very unusual things in my classroom. I was taking all sorts of chances that I would never take today if I were in a classroom, only because I was young and somewhat, just nobody could hurt me, because I could always make a living in music, or I could always make a living in the hardware store where I had worked for over 20 years. I left that out. My parents in Ireland, my grandfather on my father's side had a hardware business and an ironmongery that had been passed down to him from the previous generation in Kilkenny. And so I knew the family had this business background, and it was in hardware. So when I came to Long Island, where did I go to work? I always looked to family for my ideas. I saw hardware, so I went to work in a hardware store up in the Plainview Shopping Center. And I stayed there for something like 20 years, part-time. And what with the discounts and being a homeowner and doing it served me very well. They couldn't pay me but I had perks. At any rate, gee whiz, what was I saying? I got.
You were talking about my book.
I got something about the hardware. I wanted to mention the hardware because it was taking me somewhere.
Taking chances in the classroom.
Thank you. That's what it was. That was the year, 1973, was the year that some people will never let me forget. Not that I'm terribly ashamed of it. It was nothing to be ashamed of. It was just a wacky thing that I did. I came in. We used to have back to school night, as all of us will remember, at the high school, and very often the staff and students outnumbered the parents, because parents were working. They had 3 or 4 or 5 children. They couldn't be in every building at the same time, and parents' night was always just one night, and if you had to visit a school, you had to go to all of them, and they were just, so the classes frequently, the only classes where you had really good attendance were the honors classes and the kids who were tracked in A-B classes. The slower tracks, you didn't get that many people. I had always felt, from the time I began teaching, that parents occupy a powerful and an integral part in the education of any young person, and that they had to be involved in the education of that child. If they weren't involved and they didn't show their involvement and their commitment, the education of the child suffered. In order to drive that point home, I did something that I guess some people thought was really crazy. I came into school that night wearing a black hood. It was a muslin hood, so you could see through it. I could see through it. They couldn't see in. So when I sat at the desk and parents came in to meet me, here I am sitting with a black hood over my head. And I never mentioned the hood. I just said, hello, you're Mrs. So-so, I'm John Sherin, and we talked. And I shook hands and they sat down and they're looking at me, but they can't see my face. They can't see my eyes. They can't see anything. And I remember it was a rare instance when one person, one mother, said to me, why do you have that on your head? And I told her. I said, your parents entrust their youngsters with me. They don't know me. They don't know how I think. They don't know what my values are. They don't know anything about my faults, my peculiarities, and yet they trust me with the life of their child for X number of hours every day. I said, I think it's important that people not come up here for the space of 10 minutes and go home and say, oh yeah, I met Mr. Sherin, I know him. They don't know me. And I said, so I put a hood over my head to dramatically communicate the fact that if you want to get to know me, let's make a date to have a cup of coffee. I'll come over to the house, or we'll go out at Friendly's and we'll sit down and we'll talk, with or without your daughter or your son. If you really want to get to know me, come on in some other time. Don't come in back to school night and that night only. If you'd like me to come to your house, I'll be happy to. But I'd like to involve you more in what I'm doing in the classroom. Meanwhile, as I'm having this conversation with this one person, other parents are coming, looking in the door, giggling, the masked marvel. I was getting all sorts of things. A note went to the principal, and then another call went to the board, and of course I had to write a whole letter of explanation of what I had done and why I had done this, and I was called in to justify everything else. In the light of what has happened in recent years with abuse of power in bureaucracies, whether in public schools or in any of our institutions, I think the point that I was trying to make was well advised at that time. Parents must be intricately involved and intimately involved with the education, so much so that many parents have just turned their back on schools and are educating their own more and more every year. But that's another subject for another discussion.
When did you retire, John?
I retired in 1992 after 30 years, just a little bit short of 30 years service. You know what? Before I tell you that, Karen, I want to say that year, 73, that began the preparation for the alternative school was also I just realizing that happened after the alternative school opened. In order to get attention gather or garner attention for what we were doing there, I had come to a first day of school at the Sonderling Auditorium. I guess it must have been 1977. With I sat in the back of the auditorium dressed totally as a clown, and I had gotten that idea from Corinthians. You know, that the reference is that people who think they're smart, they're really not smart. People who think they're wise, they're not wise. That there's a whole other level of wisdom here, and of course it's coming through the Bible. That there's another level of what people need to know that they don't know that they should be paying attention to. So it was almost as if it was saying to me, there are a lot of foolish people who think they know the answers, and I'm just looking at public education at that point, and I'm saying this is not the way to educate by getting larger and larger and larger schools. We need to downsize. There needs to be more personal contact, and yes, there's money is an issue that has to be resolved, but if you make money the primary issue, you're going to lose the focus. It's about kids. It is really first and foremost about children and about children's lives. In order to really educate them, not to school them, but to educate them, you have to do that in more intimate settings, and that means downsizing. So I came in dressed as Emmett Kelly, more or less, with the face makeup and the bulbous nose and the cap and the hat and the old rag clothes and big floppy shoes and a shopping bag. And at some point during the guy who was in charge of security was up there talking at the time. I can't remember it. At any rate, there were a number of Ed Frankie was up talking, and there were a number of other assistant principals who were also talking, and I got up and I started walking down the aisle like Emmett Kelly might have done, without the spotlight. And I reached in, I took out a head of lettuce, and I started peeling off a piece of lettuce and passing it down the aisle like we hand out ditto sheets, in the classroom, and I'm panning this nourishment out the aisle down the aisle to people, and people are looking at me, and some people are embarrassed. They want to ignore. They don't know who I am because I was so totally anonymous with all this makeup and red paint, and Ken Moss had done an excellent job painting me up with a suit. I had a suit and a tie. Nothing matched. It was all ill-fitting. And following that, I went back and sat down, and then ultimately Stan Yankowski got up, and I had clued him into what I was going to do. Stan Yankowski got up, and I come down the aisle, and I'm going to present him with a watermelon. I'm going to give him an award as he's speaking at the mic. And just as I'm about to present him with the watermelon, I feign tripping over my own feet, and the watermelon hits the ground and smashes into a million, mostly liquid, all over the place on the floor. At this point, one of the administrators, who it may very well have been Ed Frankie, I think it might have been, in effect gave permission to the entire assembly, which is wall-to-wall teachers, to laugh. And once he laughed, they laughed. But until that time, with one or two exceptions, Gilda Manton was sitting in the middle of the auditorium, and as I passed her a leaf of lettuce, she gave me the most loving smile and look. And there were a couple of teachers. Ed Hannon was sitting next to her, and Cal was there. There were a number of people who looked at me, not knowing who I was, knowingly getting it, getting the joke and laughing. But once it was undertaken from my end, it was the loneliest, most horrific experience. And I couldn't wait to get out of there. I was so uncomfortable. I just felt, this is not funny. This is tragic. This is so upsetting to me. I wish I had never done this. But I was trying from a good place to make something very interesting and different out of something that is so routine. Every year we just went through it without ever anything, any thought or feeling being given to what we were doing. That stands out in my memory as one of the moments that I don't regret doing, but it was provided a profound insight into what we were doing to and with one another. You asked me what I was going to miss. I really don't. Honestly, I'm really not missing anything because I still have everything that I had that was of value. The relationships that I had with my colleagues and with my students that are now my former students, I still have. And just today, I was communicating before I came to do the interview with Judy Freilicher, who is up in the Albany area, who has purchased the domain name www.maslowtoffler.com. I laugh because that's the name of my website and my entrepreneurial effort. And I've been helping her by sending her historical material and photographs, and she's loading everything up there. And the conversations that we have on a daily basis online, and the connections we're making with other people when we send them, hey, go and look at so-and-so, your picture from 24 years ago. It's all still there. The fact that educational doors are still being opened to people, and I still feel like I'm a mentor to some of these people. I don't miss anything of that nature.
Did any of these kids come back into the district?
Many of them came back as teachers. Patty Gemolero is one who comes to mind immediately. Tony Felicio's daughter taught for a while in the social studies department in Brentwood. I don't know if she's still there. His son, Tony, is a special ed teacher today, but not in Brentwood. Yeah, there are other. Grace DiFiore, I think she's in Brentwood. You know, Karen, I can't off the top of my head give you the list of all of the people who are, but I know personally probably of 8 people that have come back that went through the alternative school.
How many kids went through the school?
Well, it was 9 years, probably about 800, I think, in total.
Did you ever do a breakdown on what kind of professions they went into?
Well, that's something that somebody might want to do as a study sometime. What I do know is that there were, in some cases, 3 and maybe even 4 people from the same family who came into the school, because Conrad Follinsby did that follow-through, that study. But in terms of what their professions are today and where they're working today, I know a few of them are homeschooling their kids. I know other people are working in very high-tech professions. There are some in security. Greg DeCanio is now in charge of security for MacArthur Airport. I know some of the people and what they're doing. I know some of the people and they're all over the country. John Stumpf is out in Seattle, Washington on the Sound out there, and sends us pictures of his beautiful home and the beautiful view. And he is very involved with some children, with children, raising children, I should say, and even handicapped children that he takes care of. I don't have all the results of that.
Suzanne Bellinger, Marco graduate?
I don't know if she was. I don't think she was. Maybe in the later years after. I left there in 1980. Yeah, I think I left in 1980. If she came after that, I remember her at all the board meetings with her mother. That I remember. But and certainly she had enough exposure to what the school was about and what we were trying to do. But I don't know.
Yeah, she's on the board.
She is.
Yeah.
Ah.
Besides Rob's and keeping up with the kids from Oslo, what have you been doing since you retired?
The first thing I did, Karen, in 1992 is that I had always wanted to do is trace my family's roots. And so for both sides of the family, I did a family directory. And I went back as far as I could without the internet in those days. And now I just don't have time to get back into it to finish or to continue with that work. But I compiled a directory of family members, living and deceased, on my mother's side of the family. And when I finished that, I self-published about 80 copies of it and distributed to each member of the family for them to update on their own. At least they had something that they could work from at that point. And I did it really as a labor of love. I've always wanted to do it, and I felt a sense of closure, or at least accomplishment, when I did it. My father's side of the family was more complex, even though as far back as I went, some of the earliest names were Michael O'Reilly, who fought against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And I have a snuff box that was presented to him. He was a sergeant at arms, and it was presented him by his British commander in, I think the date, at the time of his retirement, it was in the 1840s, I believe, when they presented it. It was beautiful silver, gold inlaid snuff box. And for a British officer to give an Irishman that kind of a snuff box back then, he really had to be some kind of a guy, because there was no love lost between those two groups of people. That's the earliest. My father insisted that he once saw the family tree in Waterford when he was a child, that the family had contacted a lawyer to do a search, and the lawyer had done the search. God knows whatever happened to that particular search. But my father remembered it because he says, as a child, he said, I was interested in the fact that at the top of that tree, there was somebody called Madcap O'Driscoll, who was a sea captain. And I, thinking, since that time, I just hope he wasn't a slave trader or something, because that, do that kind of research, you're able to find out any kind of surprise. But after I did that, Karen, in the 90s, in the early 90s, I really just enjoyed kicking leaves and walking in the snow and walking on the beach. I spent a lot of time in the public library, just the peace and quiet of not a lot of people talking to you at one time and asking you to do things for them, and reading what I wanted to read and catching up on books that I wanted to catch up on, and spending time in bookstores that I had time now to do that. I enjoyed the seasons at first, and I slept and I slept and I slept. I've always needed 8 hours sleep a night. Seldom as a teacher did I get 8 hours sleep a night. I would get by on 4. I would develop cold sores. I would catch cold easily. I would be susceptible to bronchitis. My immune system was shot by the time I retired. So the sleeping and the charging of the batteries was just so very important to me. And people would say when I come back to the high school, "You look great. What are you doing? What's different?" I said, "I'm sleeping." And that was no lie. And the dark circles disappeared under the eyes. Somebody called it the raccoon club, you know.
What's your favorite book?
One of the most powerful books that I read in my early teaching career was a book called The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm. I went out and I bought as many copies as I could buy and afford to buy, and just gave them to friends at the time. And I had a friend, John Slattery, who was at that time living here, eventually went back to live in Ireland and became the equivalent of a superintendent of schools over there in the vocational area of education. I gave him the book. He used to commute to New York City where he worked, and he was afraid to read it on the Long Island Railroad. I mean, on the Long Island, he put a brown cover over it because The Art of Loving. He was afraid in 1960 that people were going to think that he was reading a blue book, as it were. There are lots of books that I guess are my favorite and have had an enormous impact on me. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Future Shock, Breakpoint and Beyond, which is the latest book by George Lockland, who wrote Grow or Die, Transformation Theory, Abraham Maslow's Work and Motivation, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. All of those books had a profound effect on me and the direction I took in the field of education. And we haven't talked really at all about Maslow, Toffler, or the alternative school. That probably is, that's a whole other subject, I guess, for a completely different treatment. That was the high point of my professional life. I think if there is a top of the mountain in my career, that was it. And I wish that any teacher who would have wanted that experience, because it would not have been for everyone, because many people would not have been happy in such an environment. I say that because if you are a person who requires the structure of bells and a schedule that is done for you, and a course of study that is prescribed that you should teach, you may not be comfortable with the freedom of writing your own curriculum, designing your own courses, designing your own work week, being responsible for everything from soup to nuts, including spending time talking with and being a guidance counselor to the students that you had, and getting to know their families, and writing handwritten evaluations for every single student that you had every quarter, and then at the end of the year. So much of our time was spent writing evaluations. But those evaluations have stood the test of time, and students who still have them, former students, will say, "Look what you said, and how right you were. And you know what happened to me later on in life? This is what I did, and this is where I went. And boy, you saw it, but I didn't see it then." It wasn't for everybody, but it was the nearest thing that retirement is to teacher heaven. It's just indescribable, the joy of knowing that you are affecting people's lives and seeing the results of that and getting that feedback, not just from them, but from their families and their siblings, and then being embraced and taken in as as almost as part of the family, as an extended family. I think that that's something that teachers, as a rule, hear about. They know it's true, but they don't get to experience it in the way that we did. And I will never be able to thank Brentwood enough for providing that opportunity.
Did we leave anything else out?
Tons and tons and tons of stuff, but I wouldn't know. I don't know how to finish except this. When I thanked Tony Felicio outside the village school, when I had made my decision to leave the alternative school and go back into the conventional system in 1983, I thanked him, and I meant it from the bottom of my heart, because Brentwood has been so good to me, and the people that I have worked with have been such an important part of my life, that had it not been for my decision to come to Brentwood, my family would not enjoy the benefits that they had all these years of my being able to be a good provider. My friendships and my growth would not have been what it was had it not been sustained by the people who I've met here, and like yourself, and like Carmela, and like all the people that have been an integral part of my life since then. I'm very grateful for the district and for the opportunity to have served.
What made you decide to return?
I was tired, and it wasn't fun anymore. I was getting sick a lot. I got pneumonia 6 months to the day. I had it before I guess it was 1991, or maybe it was even in 1992. And when the incentive was offered, I decided that I better take this, or they're going to carry me out. I had always thought that I would work until I dropped, but it was taking so much out of me, and my health was suffering, and it was not what I expected it to be at that point in my life. I thought that when I began teaching, I was going to be able to make a difference. And I thought that by the time I finished in what was the future, 1992, we would be much better off than we had been 30 years before. The feeling was, when I looked at that it was as if somebody had taken binoculars, turned them around the other way, and the goal that I had set for myself back then was not immediately at hand. It was further away than I ever imagined it was. And I knew I couldn't, now I wasn't going to see it in my lifetime. So I might just as well take what was left of my lifetime, get some sleep, get to feel better, and do something with the talents and abilities that I had, that I was allowed to develop while I was here. And I put in I signed the papers, and then I went home and I told Ellen. And Ellen was quite not ready for my retirement. And I had to talk with her for a little while to convince her that it would be okay, that financially we would be okay, even if I didn't work. I have been, for the last 10 years, I have been involved in an entrepreneurial effort trying to get my product, Mapsels, which are map jigsaw puzzles, off the ground. I am in the process of patenting a training kit for teaching communication skills and cooperation skills and to enhance performance, both at the corporate and at the private level. And that's very, very, I expect very soon to hear that the patent will be granted on that. And that's what I've been doing for these last 10 years. I had no idea it was going to take this long, but my efforts, it's been an investment of time. And I realize that this is 10 years of my life that are very precious, because these are 10 years after retiring, which makes the time even more precious. But I've been active with BTA, and I've been with Rob's. I was active in the BTA to a degree, and now I've continued my association with my friends and colleagues in Rob's, and what with the writers group, and what with this history project. My life couldn't be any more full. than it is. I'm very grateful for everything that I have.
I think you did it. Thank you,
Okay.
John.
Thank you.